3 women betrayed and left to die in the wild prairie of 1878 by the men they loved. What they do next will shock you, and the twists won't stop until the final moment. It was 1878, and the prairie was a hungry thing. It sprawled out, a sea of gold and green under a sky so big it could swallow you whole. This land didn't care about your hopes or your heartaches. It was a place that broke things. People, wagons, spirits. They said it wasn't a place for women, especially not women alone. And that's exactly where Grace, Rose, and Ava were. Alone. Grace stared into a dying fire, its last embers winking like tired red eyes. Darkness pressed in, heavy and thick with the smell of damp earth and distant pine. The silence out here wasn't empty. It was full of sounds. The rustle of grass, the sigh of the wind, every little noise drilled into her ears. She pulled a thin, frayed shawl tighter. The cold bit at her skin, but that wasn't why she was shivering. It was a feeling. A sharp, nasty feeling that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Nearby, Rose stirred in her sleep, her face a mask of worry. She'd been quiet all day, her hands trembling as she packed away their last few rations. Those hands were usually steady. Hands that could mend a shirt or knead dough from practically nothing. But not today. Last night, her husband Rex had hit her. Not a quick slap she'd learned to ignore. This was a brutal, backhanded blow that sent her sprawling in the dirt, splitting her lip wide open. Grace found her there, blood on her mouth, her eyes empty. Rose never cried. She just shook her head when Grace tried to help, as if to say, "What's new?" Ava, the youngest, was curled up beside Rose, lost in some bad dream. She was the one who still believed in love stories. When her husband, Sam, had courted her with soft words, her face lit up like she was seeing the sun for the first time. But that was before. Now, his name was a bitter taste in her mouth. Grace had never trusted any of them. Tom, her own husband, was the worst of the lot. He saw her as a tool. A strong back, a pair of hands to cook and mend. Someone who wouldn't complain. He never loved her. Lately, the way he looked at her. It was with a cold sneer that made her blood run cold. A twig snapped in the darkness. Grace went stiff, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered into the black, holding her breath. Nothing. Just the horses, shifting nervously where they were tied. She let out her breath, but the feeling didn't go away. She looked over at the other fire, the men's fire. Tom, Rex, and Sam were huddled together, whispering. Their voices were too low to hear, but their heads were close, like wolves planning a kill. She'd walked past them earlier to grab a pot, and they'd gone dead silent. They looked up at her like she'd caught them burying a body. That silence was heavy. It was wrong. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they weren't just planning the next day's journey. They were planning an ending. Grace knelt and shook Rose awake. "Get up," she whispered, her voice tight. Rose groaned. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," Grace said. "It's the men." Rose sat up, wincing. "You never trust them." There was no bite in her words, just pure exhaustion. "This is different." Grace woke Ava next. The girl jolted up, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" "Get up," Grace commanded, "and stay quiet. We need to listen." They crept through the tall grass, staying low, using the shadows as cover. The crackle of the men's fire hid the sound of their bare feet on the cool earth. They stopped just close enough to hear, their hearts pounding in unison. Tom's voice cut through the night, hard and sharp as a shard of glass. "They'll slow us down. All this extra weight will get us killed out here." Rex's voice was thin and cold. "We can't keep hauling them around. It's time." Sam, ever the weak one, hesitated. "But if we just leave them, they'll die." A pause. Grace saw Tom take a long drag from his pipe, the cherry glowing a sinister red in the dark. Then he spoke, and his words were flat and final. "That's not our problem." The air went out of Rose's lungs in a soft, choked gasp. Grace grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard, silencing her. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading. The men they'd married, the men they'd followed into this godforsaken wilderness, were talking about them like they were sacks of grain to be discarded. Ava was shaking beside her, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "They wouldn't," she whispered, a desperate plea. "They will," Grace said, her voice hard as prairie stone. The men stood. Tom kicked dirt over their fire, smothering the flames with a hiss. "We leave before dawn," he announced. Rex stretched his arms, like he was shrugging off a heavy coat. "And the women? The supplies?" "We take the horses, the wagon, and everything useful," Tom said, his voice void of any emotion. "Let the prairie deal with them." "Ava," Sam started, his voice cracking. "She's not your problem anymore," Tom snapped. The conversation was over. Grace pulled them back, deeper into the darkness, her mind racing. They had no weapons, no food, nothing but the clothes on their backs. The prairie was a killer, and their husbands were about to hand them over. Rose clutched her arm, her nails digging in. "What do we do?" There was only one chance, one impossible, desperate move. "We take the horses," Grace whispered, the plan forming as she spoke it. "We take them and we ride." Rose's eyes went wide in the dark. "They'll kill us." "They're going to kill us anyway," Grace shot back. She turned to Ava, whose face was a pale blur of terror. "Can you do it? Can you be quiet?" Ava swallowed hard, her whole body trembling. But then she nodded. She was always light on her feet. If anyone could sneak past them, it was her. They moved like ghosts through the grass, their breath held tight in their chests. The horses snorted softly as they approached. Grace reached out, stroking a mare's neck, murmuring soft words to keep it calm. "Easy, girl, easy." Ava's fingers brushed against the leather reins. For a second, Grace thought they might actually make it. Then a boot scuffed on stone, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the dead of night. Grace spun around, her stomach plummeting. Tom was standing there. He was holding a rifle, and he was grinning, a slow, mean grin that said the game was over. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with poison. Before they could scream, the others were on them. Sam grabbed Ava from behind, his arms locking around her like a vice, dragging her back toward the wagon. Rose turned to run, but Rex was faster. He seized her arm, twisting it behind her back until she cried out and her knees buckled. Grace lunged for Tom, a wild cry ripping from her throat. He didn't even flinch, he just swung the rifle. The heavy wooden stock caught her square on the side of the head. Pain exploded behind her eyes. The world flashed white, then went dark as she hit the ground. The taste of dirt and blood filled her mouth. Through a dizzying haze, she saw Tom crouch over her. His rough fingers gripped her chin, forcing her head up. "You always were a stubborn one," he said, and there was almost a hint of admiration in his voice. Then he shoved her face back into the dirt. Sounds swam around her. Ava's desperate sobs, Rose's panicked breaths. "Time to go, boys!" Tom called out. The wagon creaked. The horses whinnied. Ava screamed Sam's name, a raw, broken sound that echoed across the empty land. He didn't even look back. The sound of hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the lonely howl of the wind. And then they were gone. Grace pushed herself up, her head throbbing. Blood, warm and sticky, dripped from her split lip. She stared into the blackness where the men had vanished. Rose was sobbing beside her. "They left us." "I know," Grace said, her voice flat. Ava was crumpled on the ground, her shoulders shaking. "We're going to die out here." Grace looked at her two companions, then out at the vast, unforgiving darkness that surrounded them. A cold rage, purer than anything she had ever felt, burned away the pain. She lifted her chin, and her voice cut through the night. "No," she said, "we're not." But as the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in 6 shades of orange and pink, a new horror dawned. They were alive. For now. But Tom hadn't just taken the horses and the food. Grace felt for the small leather pouch she always wore tucked in her dress. It was gone. Inside was a map, hand-drawn by her father. A map to a place he called the Last Spring, a hidden sanctuary with fresh water and fertile land he'd discovered years ago. It was their only hope, the secret destination she'd been guiding them all toward. Tom knew about it, and now he had it. He hadn't just abandoned them. He had stolen their future and was riding straight for it, leaving them to die of thirst on the way. The prairie stretched on, endless and brutal. The cold of the night seeped into their bones, a deep, aching chill that no amount of huddling could fix. They had nothing. No fire, no food, no water, just the clothes on their backs and the fresh bruises their husbands had left as parting gifts. Grace pressed a hand to her throbbing temple. The dried blood cracked. The physical pain was a dull anchor in a swirling sea of fury. He hadn't just left her. He'd stolen from her. He'd taken her father's last gift and was going to claim it for himself. Rose sat with her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. Her eyes were fixed on nothing. Ava shivered beside her, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. The silence was a thick, heavy blanket. What was there to say? They had been discarded, thrown away. When the first weak light of dawn touched the sky, Grace forced herself to stand. Her muscles screamed in protest. "We move," she said, her voice raspy. "If we stay here, we die." Rose looked up, her eyes hollow. "Where do we go?" "He has the map, Grace." "I know," Grace snapped, then softened her tone. She scanned the horizon, a flat, unbroken line in every direction. "Tom has a copy. A crude one I made so he'd stop pestering me about the original." Rose and Ava stared at her. "The original?" Ava whispered. Grace reached into the hem of her worn dress, where her fingers had sewn a secret pocket years ago. She pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped piece of parchment. The real map. It was faint and worn, but it was there. A tiny flicker of hope ignited in the cold dread. "He's going the right way," Grace said, her voice grim. "But he doesn't know the whole route, the shortcuts, the dangers." Ava let out a bitter, shaky laugh. "So we follow them? The men who left us for dead?" "We're not following them," Grace said, her eyes hard as flint. "We're going to beat them there." They started walking. The sun climbed, hot and merciless. The prairie, beautiful from a distance, was a killer up close. The air grew thick and heavy. Sweat soaked their dresses, gluing the rough fabric to their skin. Thirst was a living thing, a claw scraping at the back of their throats. Hours blurred into a miserable, aching haze. Every step was an agony, their feet blistered, their legs burned. Ava stumbled, her knees giving out. Grace caught her before she hit the dirt. "Keep going," Grace urged, her own strength failing. "I can't," Ava sobbed, her body limp. Rose leaned against Grace, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to stop. Just for a minute." They collapsed under a lone, skeletal tree, whose crooked branches offered pathetic shade. The world shimmered in the heat. There was no sound but the wind and the buzzing of insects. They were dying. Grace knew it. The map was useless if they couldn't even walk. She was about to try and rally them, to say something, anything, when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Not the wind. Hooves. Her heart leaped into her throat. Panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. It could be Tom, coming back to finish the job. It could be someone worse. "Stay low," she hissed, pulling the others down into the tall grass. They held their breath, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. Figures appeared on the crest of a nearby hill, dark silhouettes against the blinding sun. They rode with an easy grace, as if they were part of the horses themselves. They wore buckskin and feathers. Lakota. Grace's mind raced. Settlers told stories of their raids, their ferocity, but she'd also heard whispers of their honor. Right now, it didn't matter. They were armed, and she and her sisters were helpless. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop just a few yards away. His hair was long and black, his eyes sharp, taking in everything at once. He scanned their torn clothes, their bruised faces, the desperation that clung to them like dust. He was flanked by two others, one older, his face a roadmap of wisdom, the other younger, with a fire in his eyes that looked like pure contempt. They just watched. Their silence was more intimidating than any threat. Grace struggled to her feet, her legs trembling. She held up her empty hands. "We mean no harm," she croaked, her voice cracking. The leader's gaze lingered on her. He said something in a language she didn't understand. She swallowed the dust in her throat and tried again. "Our husbands. They left us. No food. No water." The young warrior snorted and muttered something to the others, his lip curling. The leader didn't move. His expression was a stone mask. Then, without a word, he swung down from his horse. Grace tensed, but he didn't approach. He unhooked a water skin from his saddle and tossed it to her. Her fumbling fingers barely caught it. She ripped the stopper free, her hands shaking so badly she almost spilled it all. The water, cool and clean, was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. It was life. She drank until she couldn't breathe, then passed it to Rose, who drank with her eyes closed in pure relief. Then Ava, who gulped it down so fast it spilled down her chin. The leader, whose name she would learn was Noah, spoke to his men. The young one, Luke, shook his head, clearly arguing. The older one just nodded. Noah looked back at Grace. He gestured to his horse. An offer. Could they trust him? A stranger? A man from a people she'd been taught to fear? But then she looked back at the endless sun-scorched prairie. They had no choice. Die here, or take the risk. She met his gaze and nodded. The warriors helped Rose and Ava onto their horses. Noah reached down for Grace. His grip on her wrist was firm, and he pulled her up behind him with an effortless strength that surprised her. As they rode away, Grace looked over her shoulder one last time at the empty land that had almost been their grave. They weren't saved yet. She knew that. This was just a different kind of wilderness. When they crested a hill, the Lakota village spread out below them, a vibrant splash of life in the vast emptiness. Smoke from cooking fires drifted into the sky. The sounds of children laughing and people talking filled the air. It was a world away from the silent, brutal life she had known. But as they rode into the camp, the sounds died. Every eye turned to them. They weren't guests. They were curiosities, intruders. Noah led them to a small lodge at the edge of the camp, separate from the others. He gave them blankets and a small portion of food, then left without another word. The message was clear. You are here, but you are not one of us. The days that followed were a strange, tense dance. Rose, broken and silent, slowly began to help the older women with their chores. The work seemed to ground her, her hands finding a familiar rhythm in kneading dough and stirring pots. But her eyes remained distant, lost. Ava, on the other hand, was restless. Her fear was being replaced by a defiant curiosity. She started following the young warrior, Luke, as he trained. He ignored her at first, but she was persistent, mimicking his movements with a stick, teasing him with a boldness Grace had never seen in her. One day, he finally turned and, with a smirk, handed her a small bow. "If you are going to watch," he said, "you might as well learn." A spark ignited in Ava's eyes. Grace remained wary. She didn't trust their luck. She especially didn't trust Noah. He was their savior, but he was also their keeper. He watched her constantly with those unreadable eyes. One evening, he found her by the river. "Your men," he said, his voice quiet. "I saw them. They passed near our lands 2 days before we found you." Grace's blood ran cold. What did they do? "They were looking for something," Noah said, his gaze sharp. "They carry a bad spirit with them. A greedy spirit." He paused, looking directly at her. "What did they take from you?" Grace's hand instinctively went to the hidden pouch in her dress. She couldn't tell him. To reveal the map was to reveal her only leverage, her only hope of getting to the last spring. Trusting him felt like a trap. So she lied. "They took everything. Our food, our horses." Noah stared at her for a long moment, and she knew he didn't believe her. He knew she was hiding something. "The prairie has many dangers," he said, before turning to leave. Men are often the worst of them. His words hung in the air, a clear warning. But a warning about whom? Tom and his men? Or Noah himself? The tension in the camp was getting worse. A warrior named Zane, a rival of Noah's, made no secret of his hatred for the outsiders. He saw them as a bad omen, a weakness Noah had brought into their home. His glares followed them everywhere. One night, Grace was startled awake by shouts. She peered out of the lodge to see Zane arguing with Noah by the main fire. Zane pointed a finger directly at their lodge, his voice raised in anger. The whole village was watching. Noah remained calm, his voice low and steady, but he didn't back down. The argument ended with Zane storming off into the darkness, but the poison was now in the open. They were a source of conflict. Their welcome, thin as it was wearing out. The next day, Rose came back to the lodge, her face paler than usual. "Zane spoke to me," she whispered, her hands trembling. "What did he say?" Grace demanded. "He said, Noah is weak, that he will not protect us forever. But he could. He said if we are loyal to him, he will make sure we have a place here. A permanent place." It was a threat and an offer all in one. Zane was trying to divide them, to turn them against their only protector. That night, something shifted. Grace was cleaning a small pot when she felt a sharp pain in her side. She looked down to see a thin, carved piece of wood, almost like a needle, sticking out of a small tear in the fabric of her dress. She pulled it out. It was coated in something dark and sticky. She didn't feel sick. Not yet. But she knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that this was not an accident. It was poison, slow-acting and subtle. Someone in the camp didn't just want them gone. Someone wanted them dead. Grace stumbled back into the lodge, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held the poisoned splinter in her trembling hand. It wasn't a warning. It was an execution, delivered silently in the dark. Who had done it? Zane was the obvious choice. He hated them, saw them as a blight. But this felt different. Sneaky. Cowardly. Not his style of open aggression. Could it be one of his followers, trying to earn favor? Or someone else entirely? She looked at Rose, whose eyes were wide with terror. She looked at Ava, who was clutching the small bow Luke had given her, as if it could ward off evil spirits. They were trapped. Their saviors were becoming their assassins. "We have to tell Noah," Ava whispered, her voice shaking. "No," Grace said, her mind racing. "If we tell him, he might not believe us. He might think we're causing trouble, just like Zane says we are. It would turn the whole village against us for sure. We have no proof." "So what do we do?" Rose cried, her voice cracking. "We just wait for one of us to get stabbed again? But for real this time?" "We watch," Grace said, her voice low and intense. "We watch everyone." The next few days were a quiet, nerve-shredding hell. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sideways glance felt like an accusation. Grace felt a dull ache in her side, a constant reminder of the poison. She didn't feel sick, but a creeping lethargy was starting to set in. Her mind felt foggy. She knew she didn't have much time. The poison wasn't the only thing gnawing at her. Noah's question echoed in her head. "What did they take from you?" He knew she was lying. He knew her husband was after something specific. And if Tom was after the last spring, why had Noah brought her here? His lands were in the opposite direction. It didn't make sense. Unless he wasn't just a random rescuer. That night, she decided she had to take another risk. A bigger one. She waited until the village was asleep, the fires burned down to glowing coals. She crept out of their lodge and made her way silently to Noah's, which was larger and stood in the center of the camp. She didn't know what she was looking for. A clue. Anything. His lodge was empty. A fire pit in the center was cold. Where was he? Her eyes scanned the interior. Furs, weapons, clay pots. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was about to leave when she saw it. Tucked under a pile of furs was a leather satchel. It was worn, clearly old, but the leather was of a much finer quality than anything else in the lodge. It wasn't Lakota-made. Her hands shaking, she opened it. Inside were several items. a tarnished silver locket, a worn Bible, and a set of maps. They were surveyor's maps, drawn with precise, technical lines, and the handwriting on them. She recognized it instantly. It was her father's. Her breath caught in her throat. How? Why did Noah have her father's things? Her father had been a surveyor for the railroad, a man who respected the Lakota but worked for their enemies. He had died years ago, supposedly in a riding accident out on the prairie. She flipped through the maps, her heart pounding. They showed this entire region. But then she saw the last one. It was a map of a small, hidden valley. At its center was a spring, and in her father's familiar script were the words, "The heart of the mountain, the spirit of the land." It was the last spring, her spring. But this map was far more detailed than the one he had given her. It showed more than just the location. It showed sacred sites, burial grounds, places of power. Her father hadn't just discovered a source of water. He had mapped the spiritual center of this entire tribe. A floorboard creaked behind her. Grace spun around, clutching the maps. Noah was standing in the entrance of the lodge, his face like stone in the moonlight. He wasn't surprised to see her. He looked expectant. "You knew," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew who I was when you found me." "I knew who your father was," Noah corrected her, his voice low. "He was a good man, an honest man. He came to us, many years ago. He showed us these maps. He told us the railroad would come, and that men would come to poison the land for profit. He promised to keep this place safe. A secret." "He gave you his work?" Grace was stunned. "He gave us his trust," Noah said. "We trusted him in return. When he died, we searched for his personal effects to keep them safe. We found his journal. In it, he wrote of his daughter Grace, and of the simple map he had given her, a map to a safe place, in case she ever needed it." 1,000 pieces clicked into place. The accident. Her father's death wasn't an accident. "Tom," she breathed. "My husband. He knew my father. He worked with him." "Your husband was there the day your father died," Noah said, his voice grim. "He was no surveyor's assistant. He was a thief and a murderer. He pushed your father from a ledge and stole his work, looking for gold he was convinced your father had found. But he only found the simple map. He didn't know its true meaning. He didn't find the real maps. These maps." The world tilted under Grace's feet. Her entire life, the story of her father, her marriage to Tom. It was all a lie. A long, patient con built around a secret Tom could never quite unlock. He hadn't married her for her strength. He'd married her for her name, for the secret he thought she held. "You've been looking for him," Grace realized. "That's why you were out there. You weren't just on a hunt." "We have been hunting him for 10 years, Noah said. For the murder of your father. For the theft of sacred knowledge. When we saw his trail, we followed. Finding you, that was a gift from the spirits." A cold dread washed over her. "He's not just going to the spring to get water, is he? He thinks there's gold there." "He will tear the land apart to find it," Noah said. "He will desecrate our most holy sites. He and his men must be stopped." Suddenly, the poisoned splinter made sense. It wasn't about them being a burden. Someone knew she was connected to this. Someone knew she was the key, and they wanted her out of the way before she could reveal the truth. But who? "The poison," Grace said, pulling the splinter from her pocket. "Someone in your village tried to kill me." Noah took the splinter, his eyes narrowing. He examined the tip, then his gaze hardened with a terrifying certainty. "This is not Lakota medicine," he said, his voice a low growl. "This poison comes from a white man's apothecary. We have traded for it before. Only one person in this village has a supply of it." He looked up, and his eyes met Grace's. And in that moment, she knew. It wasn't Zane. It was someone they never would have suspected. Someone who had been kind. Someone who had offered them comfort. The old woman. The healer who had given Rose the bundle of calming herbs. The one who moved through the camp with a quiet smile, welcomed in every lodge. The one who was Zane's mother. She wasn't just a healer. She was a fanatic, desperate to see her son lead the tribe, willing to do anything to discredit Noah, the man who had brought the source of all their troubles, Grace, into their midst. She had poisoned Grace to make it look like the outsiders were cursed, to turn the people against Noah and his decision to save them. The conspiracy was deeper and darker than she could have imagined, and Tom was riding directly into the center of this hornet's nest, a greedy fool about to ignite a war. "He won't just find a spring," Grace said, her voice shaking with rage and revelation. "He's going to find us waiting for him." The revelation settled over the lodge like a shroud. Zane's mother, the quiet healer, was the serpent in their midst. She was playing a long game, using them as pawns to destroy Noah's reputation and install her son as chief. "We have to expose her," Grace said, her voice steely. "No," Noah countered, his gaze intense. "Not yet. She is respected. The people will not believe you. They will believe her. It would tear the tribe apart. We need proof. And we need to deal with your husband first." He was right. A civil war was the last thing they needed when Tom and his men were on their way to desecrate sacred land. "How long do I have?" Grace asked, gesturing to her side where the poison had entered. The lethargy was getting worse, a heavy fog in her mind. Noah examined her eyes. "The dose was small, meant to sicken, to weaken, to make you seem cursed, not murdered. You have a few days, maybe a week, before you are too weak to stand. We must move now." They returned to Grace's lodge to find Rose and Ava waiting, their faces etched with worry. In hurried, hushed tones, Grace explained everything. The murder of her father. Tom's decade-long deception. The sacred maps. The poison. Rose grew pale, clutching the pouch of herbs the old woman had given her. She threw it into the fire, as if it were a snake. She was so kind. Ava, however, was transformed. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a hard, burning anger. She gripped her bow tightly. "So we fight," she said. It wasn't a question. "We ride at dawn," Noah announced. He had gathered a small war party, Luke, the wise elder, and a few other trusted warriors. Zane and his followers were conspicuously absent, left behind to guard the village. It was a risk, but Noah couldn't afford to have a traitor at his back. As they prepared to leave, Luke approached Ava. He didn't smirk this time. His expression was serious. "Your husband, Sam," he said, his voice low. "He is not a strong man. He is a weasel. He will run when the fighting starts. But weasels are fast, and they bite when cornered. Do not hesitate." Ava just nodded, her jaw set. The journey was a desperate race against time. Every hour, Grace felt the poison's cold grip tightening. Her limbs felt heavy, her thoughts slow. Rose rode beside her, her face a mask of grim determination, as if she were trying to will her own strength into Grace. They used her father's detailed map, taking paths Tom could never have known, through narrow canyons and hidden gullies that cut days off the journey. Noah rode at the head of the party, his focus absolute. He was no longer just a chief protecting his land. He was a man on the verge of claiming a justice 10 years in the making. They arrived at the valley of the last spring as the sun was setting. It was more beautiful than Grace had ever imagined, a paradise of green grass and clear flowing water, nestled in a circle of protective cliffs. But the beauty was scarred. In the center of the valley, Tom and his men had made a crude camp. They had already started digging, tearing up the sacred ground around the spring, searching for the gold that existed only in Tom's greedy imagination. Rex and the other men were there, and so was Sam. He stood off to the side, looking nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected the trees themselves to attack him. "We attack at first light," Noah whispered, as they watched from a hidden ridge. "They will be sleepy and careless." But as darkness fell, a new complication arose. A lone rider approached the camp from the east. It wasn't one of Tom's men. It was Zane. He had followed them. He rode boldly into the camp and dismounted, speaking with Tom. They couldn't hear the words, but the intent was clear. A deal was being struck. The truth hit Grace with the force of a physical blow. Zane's mother hadn't just been trying to discredit Noah. She was working with Tom. She had sent her son to offer him reinforcements, to help him find his gold, in exchange for a share of the wealth and power. It was a full-blown conspiracy to overthrow Noah and seize control of the tribe. Zane wasn't just a rival. He was a traitor of the highest order. "He's selling his own people for a promise of gold," Luke spat, his hand gripping his knife. Noah's face was grim. "Our plan has not changed, but our target has." The night was long and tense. Grace felt the poison reaching its peak, a feverish haze settling over her. She knew she might only have one fight left in her. She would make it count. Just before dawn, as a pale, gray light began to fill the sky, they moved. They descended into the valley as silent as wraiths. Noah sent Luke and Ava to the far side to cut off any escape. He and his warriors would lead the main assault. Grace and Rose were to create a diversion, setting fire to the men's supplies. Grace moved through the camp, a burning torch in her hand. Her head was swimming, but her rage was a clear, cold fire in her gut. She saw Tom, her husband, the man who had murdered her father and stolen her life, laughing with Zane by the fire. She threw the torch onto a pile of dry goods. It went up with a whoosh. Shouts of alarm erupted. The camp exploded into chaos. Noah and his warriors charged in, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls. The outlaws, caught by surprise, scrambled for their weapons. The fight was brutal and swift. Grace saw Tom's face, his eyes wide with shock, then narrowing with fury as he saw her. He drew his pistol and aimed it not at Noah, but directly at her. "You!" he bellowed. "You should be dead!" Before he could fire, a figure slammed into him. It was Rose. She drove a skinning knife deep into his side. Tom roared in pain, shoving her to the ground. He raised his pistol again, but Grace was on him, her own knife flashing. They struggled in the dirt, a desperate, ugly fight. He was stronger, but she was fueled by a decade of hate. Across the camp, Ava had Sam cornered. He held his hands up, his face a pathetic mask of fear. "Ava, please, it was Tom. He made me." "You stood by and watched," Ava said, her voice cold as ice, an arrow knocked in her bowstring. "You let them leave us to die." "I can make it up to you," he pleaded. "We can leave. Just us." Luke's warning echoed in her head. Weasels bite when cornered. Sam's eyes darted past her toward the horses. He was looking for an escape. He made a sudden lunge, not at her, but to the side, trying to get past her. Ava didn't hesitate. She loosed the arrow. It flew true, striking him in the chest. He looked down at the shaft protruding from his shirt, a look of pure surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Meanwhile, Noah was locked in combat with Zane. It was a battle of chiefs, a fight for the soul of their people. They were evenly matched, knife against tomahawk, skill against brute force. Grace finally managed to twist the knife from Tom's hand. He snarled, his fist connecting with her jaw. Her head snapped back, the world going gray at the edges. The poison was winning. She was fading. Through the haze, she saw Tom raise a large rock, ready to bring it down on her head. This was it. After everything, this was how it would end. Then a shadow fell over them. Rex, his face contorted in a mask of rage, was standing over Rose, who lay stunned on the ground. He raised his rifle like a club, ready to smash her skull. But he never brought it down. An arrow sprouted from his neck. He choked, clawed at his throat, and fell sideways. Ava stood 20 yards away, another arrow already on her string. The distraction was all Grace needed. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she drove her knife up and under Tom's ribs, pushing with all her weight. He gasped, his eyes going wide. He looked down at her, a strange, uncomprehending expression on his face. "Grace," he whispered, as if seeing her for the first time. Then the light went out of his eyes, and he collapsed on top of her. The fighting stopped as suddenly as it began. The remaining outlaws threw down their weapons, surrendering. In the center of the camp, Noah finally overpowered Zane, his knife at the traitor's throat. Yield! Noah commanded, his voice ringing with authority. Zane spat in his face. Never! You are weak. You let these women poison our tribe. No, a new voice said. It was the elder warrior. He was holding Zane's mother by the arm, dragging her into the center of the camp. The poison came from her. The entire tribe, who had followed Zane, now saw the truth. They saw the old woman, her face a mask of hate. They saw their sacred ground torn apart for a lie. They saw Zane, who had allied himself with their enemies. His support evaporated in an instant. The warriors who had followed him turned their backs in disgust. Zane was alone. His conspiracy had crumbled to dust. Noah lowered his knife. Your own people will be your judge, he said. Grace pushed Tom's dead weight off of her. The world was spinning, black spots dancing in her vision. She had done it. She had avenged her father. Rose and Ava rushed to her side, helping her up. It's over, Rose whispered, tears streaming down her face. Grace looked at the carnage, at the sacred spring now tainted with blood. She looked at Noah, who was already directing his people to tend to the wounded and cleanse the valley. She had won her justice, but the poison was still in her veins. She swayed on her feet, the last of her strength giving out, and collapsed into darkness. Grace woke to the scent of burning herbs and the soft touch of a cool cloth on her forehead. She was in a lodge, lying on a bed of soft furs. The fever had broken. The fog in her mind had lifted. Noah was sitting by the fire, watching her. The elder is a great healer, he said, his voice quiet. He says the poison has passed. You will be weak for a time, but you will live. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her chest. She had survived. They had all survived. She learned what happened after she collapsed. Zane and his mother were exiled, cast out to wander the prairie, a fate worse than death for their people. The tribe, now firmly united behind Noah, had cleansed the sacred valley and were restoring it. The bodies of their former husbands had been burned, their ashes scattered to the wind, erased from the world. Rose and Ava were safe. Rose had found her voice again, a quiet strength replacing her fear. Ava had become one of the tribe's fiercest hunters, her skill with a bow earning her the respect of even the most hardened warriors. She and Luke were inseparable. They had a place here now, a home. But as Grace recovered, a restlessness grew within her. She was grateful to Noah, bound to him by blood and justice. But she was not one of his people. She was something else now. Something new, forged in betrayal and fire. One evening, as she sat with him by the river, he handed her something. It was her father's leather satchel. These belong to you, he said. They are your legacy. Grace looked through the maps again, her father's careful handwriting a comfort. But then she found something she hadn't seen before, tucked into a hidden pocket of the satchel. It was her father's journal. She read late into the night, devouring his words. He wrote of his respect for the Lakota, his fear of the railroad, his guilt over his role in the changing world. And then, in the final pages, she found it. A last entry, written just days before his death. I have found one last place, he wrote. Not sacred land, but my own. A small, defensible homestead, nestled in the hills a day's ride from the last spring. The soil is good. The water is clean. It is hidden. Safe. A place a man could build a life, or a daughter could start a new one. I have left a cache of supplies there. Tools, seeds, rifles, everything needed to begin again. This is my true last gift to Grace. Not just a place to run to, but a place to build from. He had included one final simple map. Grace's heart pounded. This was it. The answer she'd been searching for. Not just a place in someone else's world, but a world of their own. The next day, she showed the journal to Rose and Ava. We could build a life there, Grace said, her voice filled with a hope she hadn't felt in years. On our own terms, no husbands, no chiefs, just us. Rose looked at the women she now helped, the children who smiled at her. Ava looked at Luke, who had taught her to be strong. Leaving would be hard. We would be alone, Rose said softly. We wouldn't be alone, Grace countered, looking toward the Lakota village. We would be neighbors, allies. She turned to Ava. And you wouldn't be leaving him behind. You'd be giving him a reason to visit. A slow smile spread across Ava's face. The decision was made. They said their goodbyes to the people who had become their family. Noah stood before them as they mounted their horses, laden with supplies gifted by the tribe. Your father would be proud of you, Grace, he said. There was an unspoken emotion in his eyes, a deep respect that went beyond words. Will we see you again? She asked. The sun rises and sets, he said with a small smile. The seasons turn. Our paths will cross again. The three women rode out of the valley, not as victims fleeing a cruel fate, but as pioneers heading toward a future of their own making. They followed the final map, their hearts light. They found the homestead exactly as her father had described it. A small, sturdy cabin overlooking a peaceful valley, a clear stream running nearby. The cache of supplies was there, waiting for them. They had work to do, a home to build, a life to create from the ashes of their old one. As the sun set, casting long shadows across their new land, the three women stood together, looking out at the horizon. They were no longer the broken, desperate creatures their husbands had left for dead. They were survivors. They were warriors. They were free. The prairie was still a wild and unforgiving place, but for the first time, it didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. If you were captivated by the story of Grace, Rose, and Ava, and believe in the power of survival and revenge, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming your way.